I never thought a simple whisper from my neighbor's mom could make my heart race, but the moment she said, "Close the curtains first," everything changed. The first time I really noticed her, I didn't even realize it consciously. I was on my way home, carrying a bag of groceries heavier than I'd anticipated, when I glanced across the hedge and saw her moving gracefully in her garden. There was something in the way she bent to trim a rose bush, careful and deliberate, that made it feel as though she had all the time in the world. Sunlight caught the subtle highlights in her hair, warm streaks that made her look like she belonged more to a painting than to the sidewalk I was walking on. She hummed softly to herself, a low, unassuming sound that somehow reached me through the distance. I paused, pretending to adjust my bag, but in reality, I was just watching, entranced by her presence. There was a quiet confidence in her posture, the way her shoulders relaxed yet remained poised, as if she knew exactly where she fit in the world. At the same time, I sensed a fragility, almost a vulnerability, hidden beneath her composed exterior. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was subtle, a gentle hesitation in the tilt of her head when she looked up at the sun or the soft way she touched the petals of her flowers, as if afraid to bruise them. I remember the scent of lavender drifting through the warm afternoon air, faint but unmistakable, lingering long after she had leaned over the hedge to check the soil. It was clean, soft, and oddly comforting, a scent that somehow seemed to mark her as separate from the rush of everything else around her. I felt my chest tighten in an unfamiliar way, a flutter that made me aware of how my own heart was suddenly conspicuous in my chest. I wasn't sure if it was admiration, curiosity, or something more complicated I wasn't ready to name. I found myself inventing excuses to cross paths with her, lingering near her driveway under the guise of checking my mailbox or jogging slowly past her house. Each time, I studied the way she moved, how her eyes crinkled when she smiled at a neighbor, how her fingers lingered over the garden tools she used, the delicate precision in everything she did. It wasn't lust, not exactly, it was a fascination with the quiet grace she carried, a deep, unspoken urge to understand the life behind her serene exterior. And yet, even in those moments of quiet observation, I felt the hesitation of my own inexperience pressing against me. I knew I shouldn't notice her this way, she was older, wise in ways I was not, and yet I couldn't help it. Something about her presence drew me in, and in that small stretch of street, on that ordinary afternoon, my world shifted imperceptibly, and I didn't even realize that it was just the beginning. I had been standing in her kitchen for only a few minutes when it happened. I was there to help with something small, carrying in groceries, maybe fixing a stubborn light switch, yet the room felt charged with a quiet electricity I didn't understand at first. She moved around with a calm efficiency, reaching for a jar of sugar or rearranging cups on the counter, but there was a softness to her gestures, a grace in how her fingers lingered over objects, almost reverently. Then, as I leaned to open the sliding glass door, she stepped closer. "Close the curtains first," she whispered, and it was as if the ordinary words had been dipped in some secret warmth. Her voice was low, almost a caress, and the tip of her breath brushed the shell of my ear. It wasn't startling in a sharp way, more like a spark settling deep into my chest. I froze, the mundane act of pulling the curtains becoming suddenly charged with meaning I didn't fully comprehend. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and vanilla, and I noticed the quiet rhythm of her movements, a gentle sweep of her hand along the counter, the soft tap of her slippers on the floor. Even in that brief, whispered exchange, I felt an intimacy that wasn't spoken aloud, an unspoken acknowledgement that for a moment, the world outside had vanished. My fingers brushed against the curtain fabric, heavy and warm under my touch, and I became painfully aware of the proximity of her presence. I tried to focus on the task, tugging the curtain closed, but I could feel her just behind me, the warmth of her shoulder almost brushing mine. I caught a faint scent of her perfume, something soft and floral, mingling with the air in a way that made my chest tighten. Her eyes weren't looking directly at mine, yet I could feel her attention, the careful way she noticed my hesitation, my small movements, the subtle shift of my weight. It was such a simple moment, so ordinary in every outward sense, and yet it was loaded with a tension that made my heart pound like I'd run a mile. I could feel the quiet gravity of her presence pressing against me, a gentle insistence that lingered after her words had faded. I realized then that the whisper, the closeness, the almost imperceptible brush of breath, had already done more than any conversation or greeting ever could. I wasn't just standing in her kitchen anymore, I was part of a delicate, silent world that she had invited me into, and I knew instinctively that nothing would ever feel quite ordinary again. After that first whispered moment, our interactions began to feel different, though still ordinary on the surface. I found myself visiting more often, under the pretense of helping with small tasks. It could be something as simple as carrying groceries inside, watering her indoor plants, or fixing a squeaky cabinet hinge. But every mundane act seemed to carry a weight I hadn't anticipated, a subtle electricity that thrummed quietly beneath the rhythm of our gestures. One afternoon, she asked me to help rearrange the living room furniture. I knelt to lift a small table while she guided me with calm, deliberate directions. Her hand brushed mine as she pointed toward the spot where it should go. Just a brush, but it lingered a fraction longer than necessary, a silent reassurance and, perhaps, a subtle test. I felt my pulse quicken at the contact, the warmth of her skin searing itself into my memory even as I tried to focus on the table. There was a comfort in this shared activity. When I handed her a cushion, our fingers met briefly, a soft, electric collision that seemed both accidental and deliberate. She smiled at me, quiet and knowing, as if she understood the chaos of thoughts whirling in my head. I caught the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the lemon polish she used on the furniture, and it made the air between us feel heavier, warmer, more intimate. It wasn't just physical proximity, it was the way she moved, the gentle cadence of her voice as she explained something, or the way she paused mid-task to watch me fumble with a shelf or a jar. I noticed everything, the subtle crease of concentration on her forehead, the soft rustle of her blouse, the warmth radiating from her presence that seemed to envelop the space we shared. There was no rush, no need to speak overtly about feelings or intentions. The closeness itself was enough to create a connection, a silent acknowledgement of the bond growing between us. I realized, slowly, that I was drawn to her not just because she was beautiful or graceful, but because of the quiet, steady energy she brought into every interaction. Her trust, expressed in these simple shared tasks, made me feel protective, attentive, and achingly aware of every brush of skin, every smile, every fleeting glance. Each moment was unremarkable in isolation, yet together, they wove a tapestry of intimacy and quiet longing that neither of us needed to name aloud. By the time I left her house that day, my hands smelled faintly of lemon polish, my mind replayed every gesture, every soft touch, and I felt the slow, undeniable pull of an affection that was only beginning to bloom, fragile and precious, like the first tender shoots of spring. By the time the next week rolled around, our interactions had taken on a different rhythm. There was a subtle familiarity between us now, a comfort that allowed for small teasing gestures and playful banter. Nothing overt, nothing rushed, just glances, smiles, and the kind of teasing that lingered just on the edge of something more. I could feel it in the way she watched me reach for the wrong jar or fumble with a kitchen tool, her lips tugging into a half-smile that seemed to say, "I know you better than you realize." One afternoon, I was helping her bring in a basket of laundry from the line. She leaned over to untangle a particularly stubborn sleeve, and our hands met again. This time, the touch lingered a heartbeat longer, deliberate yet natural, as if testing boundaries in a way neither of us needed to speak about. I could feel the warmth of her skin, the subtle pressure of her fingers as they brushed against mine, and my chest tightened with a mix of anticipation and restrained excitement. Her laughter became a familiar melody, light and warm, echoing softly against the walls of her home. I noticed how it wrapped around the room, how it made ordinary tasks, folding towels, arranging cushions, dusting shelves, feel like shared adventures. When she leaned close to adjust something on the counter, the faint scent of her perfume would drift past me, a gentle floral warmth that left me dizzy in the most unassuming way. She began to tease me more openly, correcting my mistakes with a soft chuckle or offering playful suggestions in her calm, melodic voice. "Not like that," she said once, her hand brushing my shoulder as she guided me, "try this instead." There was a tension in the brush of her skin, an intimacy in the way her attention seemed so focused on me, that made my thoughts tangle and my heart pound with something I didn't dare name. And yet, everything was careful, measured. There was no rush, no overt declaration, just a dance of proximity and attention, each moment layered with unspoken meaning. Even a simple glance, the way her eyes met mine across the kitchen, a flicker of amusement in her gaze, carried weight, a promise that this connection was growing into something more than either of us could ignore. By the time I left that day, I walked home feeling both light and heavy at once. The air seemed charged with quiet possibility, the memory of her smile and the warmth of her hands lingering like a soft echo against my skin. There was a thrill in the subtle flirtation, a delicious tension in knowing that each small touch and playful glance was weaving us closer together, even as the world outside remained oblivious to the quiet, slow-burning connection taking root between us. It was a quiet evening when the atmosphere between us shifted, not with a dramatic gesture, but in the gentlest, most unassuming way. We were sitting in her living room after I had helped her carry in groceries. The windows were open just enough to let in the evening air, carrying the faint scent of her garden and the distant hum of the neighborhood. She moved around the room, adjusting cushions and lighting a small lamp, and for a moment, I watched her in silence, noticing how the soft glow outlined the gentle curve of her face and the subtle warmth in her eyes. Then, as if compelled by some unspoken trust, she settled on the couch beside me. The room felt smaller suddenly, more intimate, and I became acutely aware of every subtle motion, the way her fingers traced the edge of the cushion, the quiet cadence of her breathing, the softness in her tone as she spoke. She began to share pieces of herself, small confessions of loneliness she had long carried, moments when she felt unseen, unappreciated, even in a world full of people. Her words were quiet, almost hesitant, but laden with emotion. I found myself leaning in, not just to hear, but to offer silent support. My shoulder brushed hers, accidental and yet deliberate enough to anchor her in the moment. The warmth of her presence pressed gently against me, grounding me in a way that was almost tangible. I could feel the steady beat of her pulse through the small spaces where we touched, and it was as though the rhythm of her life was quietly syncing with mine. At one point, she rested her head briefly on my shoulder, a fleeting gesture heavy with trust. The weight was soft but grounding, a tangible reminder that she trusted me more than she let on. I felt my heart respond instinctively, a protective, tender swell of affection rising up, and I realized that our connection had grown beyond playful flirtation. It had deepened into something fragile, beautiful, and profoundly intimate. The air in the room seemed to thicken with unspoken understanding. I could feel the vulnerability radiating from her, yet it was tempered with a quiet strength that made the moment feel sacred. Every small movement, the brush of her fingers against mine, the gentle sighs as she spoke, the way her eyes sometimes flicked to mine with a soft, searching light, pulled me closer emotionally than anything else ever had. By the time she lifted her head and smiled softly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, I knew that something had shifted irrevocably. The playful teasing, the quiet proximity, had paved the way for this, an intimacy that transcended words, a connection grounded in trust, warmth, and mutual acknowledgement. I left her house that night with a lingering awareness of her presence, a quiet ache in my chest, and the realization that our bond had entered a deeper, unspoken realm, fragile yet undeniably real. The tension between us had been building for weeks, subtle yet undeniable, and that afternoon, it seemed to crystallize in a way I hadn't expected. I was helping her carry a heavy box from her garage to the living room. She reached for the corner at the same time, and suddenly, our hands met, gripping the same edge. For a fraction of a second, I felt the warmth of her palm against mine, the pressure of her fingers lingering as if testing, measuring, acknowledging the closeness between us. The brush of her skin was electric, a quiet spark that left my chest tightening in a way that was both thrilling and disorienting. She gave a soft, almost imperceptible laugh, not nervous, but teasing, as though she sensed the sudden awareness that had passed between us. Her eyes met mine for just a heartbeat, and in them, I caught something that made me pause, a subtle longing, a curiosity mirrored in my own expression. The air between us seemed charged, almost tangible, thick with things unspoken. I realized, with a mix of excitement and apprehension, that neither of us could fully ignore the tension we had been dancing around. As we set the box down, her hand brushed mine again, this time lingering a moment longer. It wasn't intentional, not in a dramatic way, but the weight of that small contact was enormous. I could feel her warmth radiating into my skin, her body close enough that the faint scent of her perfume, soft floral with hints of vanilla, enveloped me. My senses seemed heightened, every subtle motion of hers, every slight tilt of her head, every breath she drew became magnified, as if the world had narrowed down to the space between us. Then, almost naturally, she leaned slightly closer, resting her hand on my forearm to steady herself. The warmth of her touch lingered, a soft pressure that made my pulse race. I wanted to speak, to acknowledge the tension, but words failed me. Instead, I felt the magnetic pull of proximity, the silent conversation happening in our glances, our pauses, our small, accidental touches. Even as the moment stretched, there was restraint. We both knew the boundaries, the world outside, our age difference, the quiet social expectations, yet the desire to lean closer, to bridge the distance, simmered quietly, teasing and insistent. When I finally stepped back, my chest was still tight, my mind spinning with awareness of every brush of her hand, the warmth of her presence, and the almost unbearable weight of the unspoken connection we shared. That afternoon left me both exhilarated and hesitant. We were closer than ever, emotionally and physically, yet the slow-burn tension lingered, unresolved, like a quiet storm holding its breath, promising that what had begun would demand acknowledgement soon, though neither of us was ready to give it a name just yet. After weeks of subtle gestures, quiet glances, and moments charged with unspoken tension, the space between us finally felt different, softer, warmer, settled into a rhythm that spoke of understanding rather than uncertainty. It wasn't a dramatic confession or a rushed declaration, it was the culmination of all those small touches, shared silences, and fleeting smiles that had quietly shaped the bond between us. We were sitting in her living room again, the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the curtains, casting a golden glow across the furniture. I had brought over a small repair kit to fix a loose drawer, and she was beside me, offering guidance with a calm, easy patience that had always made my heart skip in ways I couldn't explain. Our hands brushed as we worked together, deliberately casual yet undeniably intimate. Every contact was warm, grounding, and loaded with the tenderness we had built over time. She paused for a moment, looking up at me with a soft, knowing smile, the kind that made the air between us feel both expansive and intimate. Her eyes held a depth of emotion, a quiet acknowledgement of the trust, comfort, and affection that had grown in the space we shared. I felt my own chest tighten, a familiar flutter that had accompanied every glance, every whisper, every brush of our hands. And yet, this time, it was accompanied by a profound sense of peace, as though the tension that had once hovered around us had melted into something steady and enduring. When I finally finished the repair, she leaned closer, resting a hand lightly on my shoulder. The touch was casual, but the warmth radiated like sunlight, anchoring me to the moment. I felt the gentle steadiness of her heartbeat through her subtle pressure, the way her fingers lingered briefly, deliberately, a silent conversation without words. I reached out almost instinctively, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture delicate, tender, and filled with affection. For the first time, the unspoken connection between us felt fully realized, not in a rush, not in urgency, but in the quiet comfort of two people who had come to understand one another deeply. Every smile, every touch, every shared silence carried meaning. There was laughter too, light and warm, mingling with the soft hum of the evening, wrapping us in a cocoon of trust and quiet joy. As I left her house that evening, the sun dipping low in the sky, I felt the lingering warmth of her presence, the echo of her gentle gestures, and the profound certainty that our connection was real, enduring, and beautifully human. It wasn't a story of instant passion, but of something far rarer, a slow, steady bloom of intimacy, trust, and affection that promised depth, tenderness, and the quiet happiness of hearts truly seen. After weeks of subtle gestures, quiet glances, and moments charged with unspoken tension, the space between us finally felt different, softer, warmer, settled into a rhythm that spoke of understanding rather than uncertainty. It wasn't a dramatic confession or a rushed declaration, it was the culmination of all those small touches, shared silences, and fleeting smiles that had quietly shaped the bond between us. We were sitting in her living room again, the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the curtains, casting a golden glow across the furniture. I had brought over a small repair kit to fix a loose drawer, and she was beside me, offering guidance with a calm, easy patience that had always made my heart skip in ways I couldn't explain. Our hands brushed as we worked together, deliberately casual yet undeniably intimate. Every contact was warm, grounding, and loaded with the tenderness we had built over time. She paused for a moment, looking up at me with a soft, knowing smile, the kind that made the air between us feel both expansive and intimate. Her eyes held a depth of emotion, a quiet acknowledgement of the trust, comfort, and affection that had grown in the space we shared. I felt my own chest tighten, a familiar flutter that had accompanied every glance, every whisper, every brush of our hands. And yet, this time, it was accompanied by a profound sense of peace, as though the tension that had once hovered around us had melted into something steady and enduring. When I finally finished the repair, she leaned closer, resting a hand lightly on my shoulder. The touch was casual, but the warmth radiated like sunlight, anchoring me to the moment. I felt the gentle steadiness of her heartbeat through her subtle pressure, the way her fingers lingered briefly, deliberately, a silent conversation without words. I reached out almost instinctively, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture delicate, tender, and filled with affection. For the first time, the unspoken connection between us felt fully realized, not in a rush, not in urgency, but in the quiet comfort of two people who had come to understand one another deeply. Every smile, every touch, every shared silence carried meaning. There was laughter too, light and warm, mingling with the soft hum of the evening, wrapping us in a cocoon of trust and quiet joy. As I left her house that evening, the sun dipping low in the sky, I felt the lingering warmth of her presence, the echo of her gentle gestures, and the profound certainty that our connection was real, enduring, and beautifully human. It wasn't a story of instant passion, but of something far rarer, a slow, steady bloom of intimacy, trust, and affection that promised depth, tenderness, and the quiet happiness of hearts truly seen.